see that there.
Oh, good idea. I'll find you too.
Jim, this is a session that we traditionally have with our students. Unfortunately, a good number of our students are gone now that we're kind of in the finals week, and those students who have finished their exams have taken off into the wild yonder. But we do have some of our students right here. And David Morrissey is at the end of the room there. And why don't those of you around the table, why don't you just go around real quickly and introduce yourself, if you would.
Sure, start with me. My name is David Morrissey. I'm a Kansas native. I have a background working in HIV/AIDS, disabilities, and public health initiatives, mainly do nonprofit work. For my summer internship, as part of my school bachelor's degree curriculum, I'll be going to Vietnam in 2 weeks, spending the summer based in Ho Chi Minh City, serving grassroots organizations, capacity building, good collaboration, that sort of thing.
Denise
Just
Parsons.
students, or do you?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Denise Parsons, Public Relations Collaborator.
My name is Dawn Zekas. I'm originally from South Dakota. Prior to coming to the Clinton School, I served in the AmeriCorps Vista program in my alma mater, working on service learning and civic issues. And this summer I'll actually be interning with the Clinton Foundation's HIV/AIDS initiative in Grenada, working with the Ministry of Health to help get more people into treatment.
Ellen Robinson, Deputy Director of GUI Doctoral Faculty.
I'm Bill Pascal. I'm an LBJ alum. So I'm here.
Great.
And have a,
Where did you graduate?
when? Eons ago. 85.
Political.
That is not eons ago.
He's a political guru here in our
Cheryl Johnson, Business Speaker Programs at the school.
And I'm one of the students. And I already told you pretty much my situation, except for I was raised in Las Vegas. And I studied international relations for undergraduate at U.S. International University in San Diego and also at the University of Amsterdam for a master's degree.
Vivian Flowers. Hello again. I went to school and graduated from UNLR, political science and rhetoric and writing degree. And pretty much my background is in politics and government, and also a bit of writing as well. I could go on, but I want to hear from you.
And you're headed to South Africa.
I am. We actually
you
had told
already
that
know about
already.
that.
Yeah.
You know Bruce Bennett, I think, who's here, and you know him. And go ahead.
Hi, my name is J.C. Horton, and I'm one of those that's very fortunate to be non-class as a volunteer at the center. So I come out to pay to get to come in every day.
Great
But
job.
it's wonderful to be a part of politics.
I think all of you know that Jim Steinberg is currently has been since the first of this year the dean of the Lyndon Baines Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin. He has a very distinguished career before that. I'm sure I'm not going to get it all right, but he was at the Brookings Institution and was head of their foreign policy studies program before he came to the LBJ School. He was in the Clinton administration, was involved in National Service Advisor, Deputy National Service Advisor, and attended the G8 Summit, or was our representative at the G8 Summit for a couple of years, if I remember correctly. He's been in the State Department, both in policy planning and in the Bureau of Intelligence and Research. He's been at the RAND Institute as a senior analyst on the West Coast. He was a senior fellow at the International Institute for Strategic Studies in London. He worked with Ted Kennedy as an aide in the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's been a law clerk with a judge in the Washington, D.C. circuit, and worked for some years in the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare before that. So he's done lots of different things. but during the last several years has been focusing a lot on national defense and foreign service and foreign studies. And so, but we're especially glad to have you because of your work at the LBJ School, which we are trying to emulate in every conceivable way here. So I forgot to mention he's a Harvard graduate who came out of the Yale Law School after that, and that started his career in government, public service. Great to have you here, Jim.
Thank you all. It's
What
great.
you might do is just talk a few minutes of the kind of things that, 10, 15 minutes, whatever you like, about some of the things that are of greatest interest to you today. And then let's just kind of open it up, and this is a very informal kind of a dialogue.
Well, I was thinking about what I wanted to talk with you all about. Of course, anything you on your mind is fair game as far as I'm concerned. But I have two main preoccupations right now. And when I first started thinking about them, I thought, well, there's one that comes out of my life from the days at the White House and Brookings, and there's one that comes out of my life at the LBJ School. But the more I thought about it, I realized that they were the flip sides of one coin. On the foreign policy side, I've spent a long time thinking about the question about what is the role of the United States in the world, and what are our objectives, and what are our strategy, how we ought to pursue that to pursue our national interests and create a safer, more prosperous world for us and for others. The LBJ School, I'm spending a lot of time thinking about public service and leadership and what the role is of a school like ours and yours in meeting those challenges, and what kinds of people do we want to have, what kinds of training do we want to give them, what are our hopes and aspirations for what they're going to do. As I said, the more I thought about it, they're really flip sides of the same coin, because in some ways, if you think about it, the United States has played quite an extraordinary role in the world, particularly during World War II and thereafter, as a necessary global leader that rose to the challenges, not only of protecting our own national interests, narrowly defined, but helping to create a more stable, prosperous, fair world. And because of that broader vision that we had as a nation, acting internationally, beginning in the immediate aftermath of World War II with the creation of the UN and what became the GATT, which became the WTO, and NATO, and a lot of the institutions that really allowed us to be leaders but bring others along, the World Bank and others, we were able to provide leadership that was accepted without coercion. People said, the United States is playing a role that's a necessary role in the world. That, for those of you who study this, it's a collective action problem, that everybody benefits from acting together, but it's very hard for somebody to organize and develop the kind of institutions and strategies to make it happen. And people resent countries that are very powerful because they worry what they'll do to them. But if they see a powerful country acting in a broader interest, they're going to be more willing to accept it. And so in a sense, the United States took on a global role of one in which we saw that our own interests were best served by this broader conception of global interest, and to try to develop a world in which everybody benefited, not just our citizens more narrowly. And it worked quite well. And this was an extraordinary period of time for the United States. The Cold War was a big test, but nonetheless, we did very, very well as a country through the period from the end of World War II until the end of the Cold War. And with some exceptions, the United States was widely accepted and admired. Our values were broadly accepted in most parts of the world, certainly at the end of the Cold War, seemed to be vindicated. We were seen perhaps not as generous as we should be, but at least a country that did care and was engaged in the world. And therefore our partnership and our friendship was accepted. To be an American was something that people could feel proud about, and people wanted to come here and associate it in very high regard. And look at the polls that took taken in the late 90s about where America's standing was quite high. And that's something we could and should have been proud of. And that has been challenged in recent times. And it comes, I think, not because the world has changed so dramatically. Yes, we have terrorism, we have 9/11, but because we have, in response to these events, taken a different, at least in recent years, seem to have taken a different approach to the question, in which we've said, we're in such danger that we have to protect our house first, and we have to take measures that sort of put our concerns front and center, and if they somehow seem to dismiss or not take into account the views of others, well, we just can't afford that luxury anymore. The world is too dangerous, the risks are too great, the urgency is too high, and so when our friends and allies say we disagree with you, we say we can't be bothered with that because we have to do what we have to do. When we take measures that seem to be outside the rule of law or accepted principles, we say, well, we have to change the rules now because the danger is too great. And I understand that impulse, and I certainly understand why leaders feel a great need to be seen as responding to these challenges. We faced the problem of terrorism on a number of occasions during the Clinton administration. You could understand the temptation, but it's not only inconsistent with our values and what has succeeded in our leadership, but in the long run, it's not going to be effective, I think, because I think what happens is when you do that you end up creating more enemies, you create more problems, you find it harder to get friends and supporters in dealing with problems that require the cooperation of others. And the reason I see this is so related to what our mission is here at LBJ School is that part of what we're trying to teach people about when we think about public service is not just to train people to go into government. I mean, it's nice that they do, and when they do, that's terrific, and we need good people to go into government. But rather to be leaders who think about the public weal in a broader sense, whether they're in the private sector, NGOs, government, wherever. But understand that you need to be farsighted about how you deal with the challenges of today, and to recognize that when it comes to the public affairs of either our country or our communities or our states or the international community, that wiser and broader sense of what the objectives are and how you achieve them are really critical, especially in trying to help shape a political debate which can be very narrow, can often make it look like appealing to narrow interest and short-term solutions are more attractive. And so while I think we all feel that schools of public affairs and public service should not have a ideological tilt, what we should have is a sense of how to get our students and the broader communities that we work with to think about these problems in this broader sense, and to at least have that wider aperture and that longer time horizon to think about how narrow goods are best served in the context of the broader approach. And that's why, for me, after a lifetime mostly being a public policy reader, it was so attractive to come to a school, a university, and a graduate school focused on public affairs and public service, because I really believe that unless we begin to get younger people and people starting off their careers both to understand the nature of these problems and to become effective advocates for that approach, that there are great dangers. And so it's exciting to be in that kind of setting. I'm very proud of our school because I think there is, in both the tradition of the school and in the students we have today, a strong sense of this. I mean, there is a strong sense of why they're there. That's different from, I went to law school, but it's different from why people go to law school and business school or some of the other professional opportunities that they have. And we need to sustain that sense. Because I think that to meet the substantive challenges that I've been talking about in international relations and our own national security strategy, you have to have the kind of people who are trained to think in this kind of paradigm and perspective that understands what it means to talk about the public good and these kinds of broader perspectives. So I think that this is, and I would say that although we've gone through a very difficult time in this country, and I think although the problem was not new, we were deeply traumatized by 9/11, I think that a sense of balance is beginning to come back into the public discourse. And I really hope that over the next 3 years, as we move into the next presidential election, that we will see more of a more balanced approach and a recognition that we need to have this broader perspective. Because it's critical. The United States has paid a big price for taking what I believe is a very long-headed approach to the problems of this fanatic terrorism that we've seen. I don't think we've taken an irreversible mistaken approach, but I think that we are at a critical period where if we can't begin to restore a sense of balance, then it will cost us a lot in the long term. So anyway, stop there if that's okay, and I'll put it up for discussion and questions.
Why don't I give first crack to our students?
Okay. I'm just taking notes. As I mentioned before, I took this math biology class, and in it we read about it's a kind of an independent entity, but they did the study about the responsibility to protect, and kind of based a lot of what we discussed on that report in determining, you know, what is the responsibility to protect, and then how do you, you know, implement that into a standard of international law without compromising sovereignty of nations who sign on to the UN Charter and, you know, subscribe to this policy. But even before going there,
You want
you
to
know what?
question?
I know I'm trying to pack a lot in. Just with everything that we read about and that we've seen in international law, there are 2 or 3 major themes or a consistent thread that I saw. And the lack of enforcement is one, and then the lack of the uniformity and the application of UN conventions and kind of the standard of human rights would be 2, and then the imbalance of the UN structure with the Permanent Security Council with this enormous veto power versus all these smaller, poorer countries. You know, I mean, to me that just sounds like a mix for some really great ideas on paper, but still people who have historically been the ones that have been responsible for, you know, slavery and colonialism and all of these horrible things are the ones that sit at the table and make decisions about how to, you know, prescribe and implement human rights.
Right, you framed the question to make a great semester-long course on the current state of international relations, and I think the questions you're asking are the good and tough ones. What it comes down to, and this really is the toughest part about where we are in the evolution of the international system, is how much can we rely on a rules-based, law-based system, and how much do we have to accept that the world is going to be messy, complicated, fact contingent, imperfect, slightly double standarded, et cetera, et cetera. It's very appealing, and I'll talk a little bit about it tonight when we talk about transatlantic relations, to sort of want to have a very kind of formal rules-based system in which we say, here's the rules, and you know they need to be uniform, applied to all circumstances, you know, like facts being treated, like all the kinds of things that lawyers like to talk about, in which we have, you know, and good enforcement mechanisms that support the rules. And in some Kantian world, that is the right answer. But the world isn't that. Mm-hmm. And so the question is, theoreticians go, how do you deal with a world in the second best, where the rules are being prescribed in ways that may not be fair and just, as you say, because they may be being set by a group of people who aren't representative of the broader community, or a Security Council that isn't representative of the world at large, or is a historical accident, where you have circumstances in which power is unequally distributed, and which countries, because of their own domestic circumstances, may be motivated to act in one case and not another. Classic case from our administration, which was pointed to us time and time again, and very important, was the difference between the Balkans and Rwanda. And so the question then becomes, do you sort of become obsessed with the idea that we should just get it straight and make it all neat and tidy in terms of a perfectly fair, just, procedurally correct, and equally applied law situation? Or do you recognize that we're going to have to work our way through this? And the evolution of the responsibility to protect, I think, is part of that dialogue.
Why can't it be both, though?
Because by definition it can't be both. I mean, that is to say that the purists, the jurists, will tell you that you have to have uniform rules in which, if you're going to say the rule is the responsibility to protect, you must do it all the time. As opposed to saying, in principle, yes, but Congress isn't going to vote for it all the time. And so maybe sometimes we aren't going to do it, even though there's a good moral claim to do it, because we can't get the support for it. And I think that's the big challenge for practitioners, is to say, how do you, on the one hand, hold out a set of principles that you care about, like the responsibility to protect, but also recognize that it is inconceivable that we're going to intervene in every case in which there's a credible claim to act on responsibility. And that, I think, is the challenge, because you will always, as a practitioner, you will always be impeached by the argument that you're applying double standards, or you're not using the same rules here or there. Why did you act in this case and not that case? What's the bright line? When we were in the Clinton administration, there was a great debate internally after Kosovo as to whether we should articulate a broad principle of U.S. national strategy on humanitarian intervention. And the President spent a lot of time asking us about this and challenging us. And there were people who had very strong views, including Tony Blair, who made a very famous speech in Chicago about this, saying we should really set this down, and Lloyd Axworthy, who was on the commission, set us down, here's the principles. I was a practitioner, and I will tell you that I didn't think I could live with that, because I didn't want to say, here's what we're going to do, and then have people come and say to me, well, but why don't you do it here? You know, and there's human rights violations going on in Uzbekistan. Why aren't you intervening there? And what are you doing about North Korea? It's horrible. Why aren't you intervening in North Korea? There are good reasons why we're not intervening in North Korea, but from a humanitarian point of view, the situation there is at least as bad as it is in Haiti, where we did intervene. And so what I'm saying is that the evolution of international law and the international system, to my mind, is one of this dialogue between principle and practice. And that the articulation of the responsibility to protect was quite important, because it basically opened the door to a new set of principles. It's important that every time you act or don't act, that you have a conversation with yourself and with the public and with the broader international community saying, why did I choose to act here? Why didn't I choose to act here? But, and it's also a reason to say, you know, I'm not going to let the rule be, we'll only act when the Security Council authorizes it. And that's the flip side. You know, the rule of law types would say, well, and it's in the latest report of the UN high-level panel, is that you should never intervene unless the Security Council authorizes it. The report, very traditional view, which says, responsibility to protect, yes. High-level panel endorses big innovation in international law. And these are not the best people in the world. This is Evgeny Primakov, the former Russian Prime Minister and Foreign Minister, Chen Shichen, the former Foreign Minister of China, accepts the responsibility to protect. Great, that's terrific. They also say it should only happen when the Security Council acts.
They're on it.
They're right or they're wrong?
On the Security Council. I mean, they're not, but.
But the point is that, but that's my point, is that, and you have, you know, some people saying, a lot of Europeans saying, the Security Council isn't there, should never do it. So here are two very broad principles in deep tension. One saying, rule of law says, the UN Charter says, it's very explicit, right? We've all signed up to the UN Charter, very explicit. You can only use force under two set of circumstances. Self-defense, under Chapter 51, authorized by the Security Council under Chapter 7, okay? Kosovo, not self-defense, no authorization under Chapter 7. Should we have not acted? Responsibility to protect, UN Charter. Two broad principles, how do you make a decision? And that's, I guess, what I'm articulating to you, is that in the end, this is a dialogue in which you have to come and say, all right, why in that case do you pick one as opposed to the other? Do you act or not act?
I don't want to be greedy. I'll follow up later when nobody has to.
Okay. I have a question. The LBJ School has a wonderful reputation for Latin American affairs. Your interest and your background has been mostly European, Middle East, and I've not seen a lot of your writings or thinking about North-South, or East and Western Hemisphere. You probably have, I just haven't seen it. Is a goal of yours to broaden the faculty and the interests and so forth? How do you think about sort of direction for the school itself?
Well, there are two parts. I mean, first of all, you're right. I mean, I've worked on practically all the parts of the world, but I would say probably the school strength, which is Latin America, is the part of the world I know least well. You know, I mean, what I probably know best is Europe, Middle East, and Asia. Probably next, Africa, and last, Latin America. Spent very little time on it, and certainly not my strength. To some extent, that's good because there are a lot of people there who know it. But I also, I mean, for us, and I don't know how you all think about it, I think about the LBJ School, we're not a standalone thing. We belong in a university. And when I think about what we do and how we think about international relations and that part of what we do, I think of ourselves as part of a great, big, very talented university in which I have faculty in the government department, history department, and economics department, and area studies departments and things that have enormous talent in these areas too. And that we need to do, and are well embarked on, a much more aggressive engagement with the university. Historically, the LBJ School, and I'll ask you, maybe you have thoughts on this, has tended to kind of stand apart from UT. I don't believe not only in international, but I think, you know, on everything that we do, whether it's health, education. I mean, goodness, we've got all these great schools, and you know, it is an extraordinary university. So part of what I think about is recruiting my faculty and what my curriculum is. But part of it is I think about how do I have a deeper engagement and make the school able to draw on, and vice versa, by the way, because I think we have a lot to contribute to the university, both at the undergraduate level and at the graduate level, to bring the policy perspective into their work, because some departments are better than others, some care more about policy than others, but they ought to care more, and we have a lot to bring. And the university has been moving in that direction. We have this thing called Bridging Disciplines and Connexus, and we have all kinds of initiatives that are around that. But when I first came to school, the pitch I made was that I wanted us to be at the forefront of building a much more interconnected university to be able to do these things. And so, for example, one of the first things that I did when I got there is I asked to sit on the search committee for the director of our new, the new director for our South Asia Institute, which is a university-wide research and studies program. Because I wanted to let people know that as far as I was concerned, I didn't want to have to hire South Asian experts necessarily onto the LBJ faculty, but I sure wanted us to be doing more and thinking more about South Asia. And so I think, you know, for us, that is the key to the strategy, is to not try to do it all within our four walls. I mean, there's certain skills and talents that we need to have, and we will recruit faculty to do because nobody else will do it. But there are other things where we're looking at joint hires, we're looking at collaborative centers. We're starting a new university-wide center on national security that is a collaborative venture of the LBJ School, the Law School, the College of Liberal Arts, and the Provost's office. And that's the direction that I see us going. And I think it's the only way in a smallish school like ours, we have 34 faculty, and we're growing, and we will grow, but we'll never, I can't have, you know, a China person and an Indian person and a Europe person and a Middle Eastern person. So that's how, but I think it's, you know, in some ways it's a luxury to be able to have these other resources.
In our beginning, we had none here, and we had to call on the entire university system to come in to teach. Plus other universities, Dr. Wagner here is with University of Central Arkansas, so it's an entirely different system. But we've drawn them from all over. It's just the opposite, of course, at the Woodrow Wilson School, where they have their faculty, but they all have their primary home in an academic discipline in the rest of the university. It's a very interesting dynamic of how those different systems work together.
I might add a footnote, Jim, back in the 70s when the school was started, and when all the different policy schools were started, we had to keep the LBJ School independent, or you would have been smothered by the liberal arts colleges. And so it was a conscious decision early on, and I think in some sense the school here has to have an identity of its own, which requires some independence, from which you then, from a position of strength, you begin to do something.
Well, I understand, and I was at Harvard at the time the Kennedy School started. I was an undergraduate at Harvard at the time the Kennedy School started. So I know quite a lot about the founding, and as somebody who was already doing public policy as an undergraduate, I mean, I certainly understood why it was never going to happen out of the Lit Tyrant School of Government. So, I mean, I do understand that, but and maybe it is a luxury of where we are now, but it is, I feel
Well, I
very
think it's
proud.
critically important. I just think that the age of an institution makes a difference in how much you can effectively do that.
Other questions, comments?
Sorry, go ahead, Dr. Bush.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. Kind of along the same terms, since our schools are kind of looking to develop the next leaders, and seeing as how leaders now in the developed world, like Western Europe and here in the United States, there are significant leadership challenges being placed before us that are so different than what we experienced throughout time, or even in the industrialized period, or known as post-industrialization growth. But it's more of, instead of hard, distinct separations of people, the state, enemy, it's now more of a psychological component that I think that needs to be addressed, and more of like, who are we ourselves, who are the other, what is our identity, what is a national identity, and do you see that as maybe the next way that we have to kind of proceed in advancing our knowledge in combating the ills of society, or do you see that as coming into the institutions of higher learning?
Well, I mean, I think it's the right question. I think that when Tredson is kind of a slight parallel, but I mean, the nation state is still here. We are all Americans, proud of that at some level. But it's also true that the nature of the problems in the society that we're well already into, those identities are much more blurred. And that is to say, we have some of a political identity as Americans. We have all kinds of other identities, and we live in a world in which the political boundaries are significantly less important in terms of identity, the things that affect us, the differences that we have. And so part of what we're talking about is leadership in a globalized and interdependent world in which you have to think about all these different streams and communities and sets of relationships, and how do you function in that. It's also a world that's less hierarchical, and so leadership is a very different set of skills than being a manager. And I do think this is a big evolution. Again, I'd be interested in your thoughts about this. I think that our school had, for again obvious reasons, had a lot of focus on managerial leadership, public sector managerial leadership, but managerial leadership. And I think that while there's still, a lot of people do that, and we still need to impart the skills to do that, that we need to think about leadership in a world which is less hierarchical and less managerial, and also how do you lead networks, and how do you influence views. And so I'm very interested in evolving the concept of leadership beyond the kind of traditional boundaries of organization and polity to this more fluid, networked world that we all live in. And it is a different set of skills and a different take on the world that you're entering than the kind of more traditional civics-y kind of world of what authority and management is like.
That your take on that really matches well on the approach that our leadership faculty took in our first semester. One of our core courses is leadership and public service, and that was very much part of the general spirit of the course of engendering servant leaders who weren't adhering to the traditional great man philosophy of what it takes to be a leader. I'd like to sort of change topic just a little bit to ask you about the topic of academic freedom. It's a hot topic after the incident in Colorado University around, I forget the professor's name, but and particularly in the setting of a public policy or a public affairs school. This school itself, I know, is looking at hosting in 2007 a student-run conference for young policymakers, or the policymakers.
We're going to host it this year.
Right, exactly. It's with your school as part of the policymakers. And I know that, I'm not on that steering committee, but I know the committee is looking at topics on racial and religious reconciliation. So when I hear about that topic, the first thing sort of I become concerned about is academic freedom, because there's a party line about religious or racial reconciliation, and then there's outside the box thinking. And I just want your take on how to entertain that.
It's a very tough question, and it's one of those things that until you have to confront it, you can be a little bit smart about thinking that you know the answers to it, and when you have to confront it, you realize that there's no good answer, and this is a very tough problem. And the reason I say this is because we had a minor incident at our school that implicated exactly what you were talking about. And I'll tell you, I don't think it's telling tales out of school. We have a student-run diversity training program at the school. And there was an ad in the student lounge, or the poster, saying diversity training seminar, blah, blah, day. And somebody scrolled over it and said, segregation training session, the next day. Academic freedom, or inadmissible, unacceptable. We had a lot of debate about it. My view, unacceptable. because there are things that are out of bounds because they deny the basic worth of human beings, and that I don't think fall within academic freedom. I don't subscribe to a view of academic freedom that says absolutely everything is legitimate on the grounds of academic freedom. On the other hand, you absolutely can't be endorsing orthodoxy. We have to be in a world in which people are allowed to challenge and debate. Our little episode was easier for me because it was anonymous and not speech, and what I recognize as a constitutional lawyer as being speech. That was just unacceptable. It's not somebody coming up and wanting to have a debate as to why this might be legitimate, which would become closer to the line for me. But defacement, anonymous, no problem. But it is a problem for universities. We, on the one hand, must be unorthodox and tolerant of unorthodoxy. On the other hand, there is a kind of an extremism, a procedural extremism that just basically says that because it's hard to tell the difference, therefore we won't try to tell the difference. And so, there is a level at which I think you have to at least say that there is certain kinds of hate speech, there's certain kinds of things that aren't acceptable. But you've got to be pretty careful not to let that become political correctness or creating whatever either the broad orthodoxy is or the narrow orthodoxy of some community.
Let's open it up to questions from anyone. It doesn't have to be students.
Well, I hate to take away from the thrust toward institution development and new school building and so forth, but you've worked with two of the most influential, fascinating women in recent American politics, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, First Lady Hillary Clinton, and they basically, during the time that you were there, launched a kind of a new strand, a positive strand of American foreign policy, kind of taking it to the people, kind of along the lines of the mission of this university, helping people rather than working with elites. And by this I mean the microcredit movement, where Hillary basically pushed for U.S. investment in projects based on the Grameen Bank, but also the thrust that women's rights are human rights, and combating human trafficking, things of that nature, urging women be educated and incorporated into economies in countries where that was not the case. Could you speak a little bit about that? I mean, it's a lot of that happened through the State Department, of course, and the office that was created there. Seems to me that doesn't happen, of course, if Madeleine Albright doesn't become Secretary of State in the first place. How instrumental was the First Lady in that appointment? And then can you speak a little bit about how successful you think that strand of foreign policy has been?
I'm not sure I can speak to how influential she was in that appointment. I mean, I think that, in part because Secretary Albright had been part of the cabinet before. I mean,
yes,
she was clearly on everybody's short list as to who was going to be the second Secretary of State. And at that level, when I got to the White House, it was above my pay grade as to how the final decision was made. There are subsequent cabinet appointments I know a little bit more about, but that one, I think there are obviously different people who favor one or the other of the leading candidates, but I mean, she was obviously for a strong candidate in both. I mean, I think part of her strength was precisely what you talked about, and I think that appealed to the president. I'm sure it appealed to the First Lady. But she also had done great work at the UN, and so obviously it showed that she was a great leader in that sense. I agree with what you said about this difference approach, and I think it has two different elements to it. One of it is has to do with a perception about how to be effective, which is I think it's generally where development policy and development theory has moved over the years, which is that bottom-up stuff tends to be more effective than top-down. That most of the failures of the kind of the first great waves of development and the old World Bank approach and all that stuff tended to be large projects, government-run, top-down, which for a variety of reasons had just a miserable track record of producing the kinds of long-term gains that development policy is supposed to produce. And what Green and other things were about was part of broader understanding that bottom-up, grassroots, indigenously grown, local, all those things seem to be more attractive. Now, there's a little bit of a pendulum back in the sense that there's a little worry about scalability, that these things do work, but are they scalable to have big, big impacts? And that's an interesting debate. And while I'm not a development economist, I've been interested and involved enough to be challenged by the question now, how do we scale the obvious local successes of the microcredit and things like that? And I know a lot of people who are involved in that. It's an interesting problem, including the private sector now getting involved in microcredit, which is actually may be the ultimate test of whether it's scalable. But so part of it was an evolution of thinking about what works. Grassroots, community-based, which would lead you to the role of women and stuff like that, because they play such a big role in that society. That's why Green had such a female focus, is because it recognized that in terms of the communities that they were trying to reach, women played a much bigger role than traditional development people thought about, because they didn't really look at the local structures. The second part, which was equally true, was that, especially with Secretary Albright, is that there was a recognition that there was a hearts and minds issue. That if you weren't talking to the people, and you only had the supports of government leaders, you were at great risk, because these leaders come and go, they're not necessarily beloved by their own people, and I think that a lot of people, including Madeline, I'm sure, were actually quite influenced, I was, by the experience with Iran in the 1970s. I think a very important lesson was learned by a lot of us who were in the Carter administration about what went wrong there, and how we lost the hearts and minds of the Iranian people over a 25-year period, and paid a huge price for that. And so a lot of what she was trying to do in her personal style of diplomacy was to recognize that in the long run, if we want to have support for America, we have to have people like America, not just kings and presidents and whatever, Politburo chiefs. So I think she believed very strongly that by reaching out directly to people as part of kind of a public diplomacy and understanding and communicating with them about who we were, what we were trying to do, that was going to serve the long-term interest of the United States. And obviously that's what Karen Hughes is all about, and that's what's going on now, is that there's sort of a broad recognition, whether we agree on how to do it or what the right thing is, that in fact the hearts and minds issue is critical. So I think you have the intersection of those two things, a theory about development and how programs work, and a theory about how the United States needed to interact with the rest of the world, which was different from the kind of Metternickian, Kissingerian view of you only had to deal with the elites. That was very transformative, and you could argue, I don't know if I'd make the strong claim, but I think it's not irrelevant that it was two women who had that perspective on it, and maybe more, might have come to them more easily than more traditionally trained and institutionalized male leaders.
Sort of extending that same theme of working at community level on issues around poverty, since so much of the developing world and in the Near East, unemployment is at huge levels, 50, 60, 70, even 80%. There's sort of an ongoing debate about the role of poverty and of dissidents and some of the more conservative Muslim movement. Your thoughts about America's role in international development, is that really going to make a difference in terms of our rebuilding our identity as the kind of place that we thought we were many years ago, as the inspiration for the world of the kind of democratic society that was helping others? What is the role of our commitment to development? And is that going to have anything to do with our getting out of our trouble?
deals with Muslim and other conservative groups?
That's a good question, and I think the answer is along similar lines of having the two dimensions, which is what's effective and what will affect how people think about us. I mean, we've been fortunate to have just run two social science experiments in the last couple of years. They're very great tragedies, but they're great social science experiences, which is, we came out of the Iraq War with U.S. standing in the world just absolutely rock bottom. I mean, the numbers in parts of the world, and two countries that I'm going to mention in particular, for reasons you'll see in a second, in Pakistan and Indonesia, where we were in single digits in favorable opinions of the United States after the Iraq War. I mean, unprecedented in our history. I mean, it's almost inconceivable we could have gotten to be viewed so badly. Two things happened, both natural disasters. We had the tsunami, and then we had the earthquake in Pakistan. In both cases, though there was a little bit of wavering at the very beginning, the United States more or less stepped up to the plate. Huge impact. I mean, if you went and looked at the polling, first in Indonesia after the tsunami relief, and second in Pakistan after the earthquake relief, positively, we're still way below historic levels, but dramatic increases in public positive perception of the United States, which shows that at least on the hearts and minds side, being seen to care, to do something, to be responsive, makes a difference. It really made a difference. I mean, the numbers went up, in Indonesia from 8 or 9% to 30 to 35% favorable. In Pakistan, it wasn't quite as big. The numbers started really low. It was like 2 or 3% favorable right after Iraq, and it went into the mid-20s. But then that's not trivial in a relatively short period of time, and indisputably linked to the relief efforts. So, on a basic level of being seen to care, of being responsive, of being generous, of being humane, empathetic, it clearly makes a difference. Now, there again is this sort of whole question of scalability impact. Now, the question is, do these things, over the long run, will they make a difference? Because will they lift lots of people out of poverty and therefore change the objective conditions under which they live? That's a complicated question. I mean, we don't have, lots of people spend a lot of time on development economics, and what works, what doesn't work. We have some great examples in East Asia, countries that have gone from desperate poverty to developed country status over a generation or two. Korea, Taiwan, to some extent Thailand, and Malaysia, soon to be at developed country levels. And then you have other examples where just nothing's worked well. And so, what the right strategy is, how much should we give, what form should it give, should it be unilateral, should it be multilateral, how much should it be in terms of trade opportunities as opposed to aid. I mean, these are all complicated policy questions, but I think it's indisputably the case that it's a necessary condition to be seen as trying. It may not be sufficient just to try, but that it is important that others see you as caring and trying to make a difference. And I believe, this can't be proven in the social science sense, that those dollars spent clearly contribute to national security at least as much as any other national security expenditure that we're making. That is, they're relatively small, but they have huge impact on how people feel about you. And though I know there's certain people in the current administration who say that our goal is not to have people like us, I don't agree with that, actually. I mean, I don't think we should do things only because we want people to like us, but it is not a bad consequence of our policies if it leads more people to have a high regard for the United States.
You're going to try that in Cuba?
I think it's indisputably the case. I mean, I think that, I understand why it's been so hard for the country to get its arms wrapped around this. I mean, not simply because of the Cuban American community, although has been the most important part of it, but it's also, it's kind of like, once you've dug a hole, it's really hard to get yourself undug out of it, and nobody really wants to be the one who says, never mind, this is all. And, we had a hard time. We struggled with that in the Clinton administration, as you know. But I don't think anybody can say the policy has been a success. What do we feel good about what we've accomplished with vis-a-vis our Cuban policy over the last 50 years?
I'll wait till the last student answer the question. You have a question? Go ahead. I just have a question related to Russia and the whole democratization movement that appears to be diminishing under Mr. Putin. What are your thoughts with respect to the changes that are being made there? I know you've been involved with some of the G7, G8 meetings, and your thoughts on democratization there. And also, what do you make of Mr. Cheney's recent remark regarding Russian oil, and what impact is that going to have on sort of rekindling the Cold War thinking that's centered around that comment?
I mean, the Russian democratization thing is complicated because, on the one hand, I mean, Putin is quite popular. You know, it's not like it's not like the Soviet leadership, right? I mean, this is a guy who could win a fair election. You then ask him, why don't you just do that? You know, I mean, why are you so afraid of it when you in fact are enormously popular? And I think it's because he is not a Democrat. I mean, he doesn't believe in democracy. So ironically, even though he could win in a relatively open democratic process, he just doesn't believe in the process. Has the culture of what he was brought up in and all that kind of stuff. But because in Russia now, this has just been a really bad 15 years for Russia. They just had a really, you know, they've gone from being, you know, the #2 dog in the world to a basket case. I mean, you know, everybody's all of a sudden, here's a country that has never had much of an economy. It's GDP the size of Belgium, people forget. I mean, it's just a really mediocre economy with, you know, a demographic bust going on in which people are, everybody's dying young and having no offspring. You know, the rate of population decline in the country is almost unprecedented in modern history, except for plagues and, you know, similar catastrophes like that. An economy which has very little future, isn't going anywhere except for extractive industries, which is a lousy basis, you know, for long-term security. And so people are really insecure. I mean, here's a guy who's trying to, you know, appeals to their greatness and, you know, tries to make them feel better about themselves, and it's understandable. And because they associate this sort of horrible 15 years with the Democrats and Yeltsin, there's just not a lot to feel for. So on the one hand, you know, I think it's quite important that we stand up and speak out on these issues of repression of speech and the mistreatment of people. We shouldn't have any illusions that the Russian people aren't largely in favor of this. And so we have to find a way to be consistent with our principles. On the other hand, not look like to the Russian people that we're different to the fact that they feel like they're better off now than they were in the Yeltsin era, and try to find ways to speak to a belief that over the long run, you will be better off if you can find your way back on the track of democracy. Not coddling Putin, I'm not in favor of that, but I'm just worried a little bit that in the harshness of the Cheney language, which on a substantive level I'm sympathetic with and agree with, is just understood by the Russian people. They're like, you want to keep us down, you want us to go back to the days of chaos, of the collapse of the ruble, of no food, of no social safety net, of Chechen terrorism, and they will hear the Cheney thing in a different way than I think we want it to be heard. And it's tough. I mean, modulating this thing right is hard. You know, the Secretary Powell didn't do a lot of things right in my judgment, but one thing he did do right, when he went to Moscow, I think it was in 2002, he went on to Echo Moskvy, which was the time of the few uncensored, unrepressed outlets in Moscow, and did a kind of a radio call-in show. And he was great. I mean, because he was able to talk about these values of freedom and democracy and pluralism in ways that didn't sort of run down the Russians' concern about their own security and the kind of the depths that they plunged to. So I just think, I mean, Cheney's man no empathy with any human being, so it's not surprising that when he gives a speech, it comes off as being this kind of very tough, harsh, demarche kind of thing. And so what is a correct message, which is Russia should be careful about, you know, playing the energy card the way they're playing it, that they need to be concerned about the repression of democracy. I completely agree with. But I think the tone was ultimately would be counterproductive.
I had a question sort of regarding the school and regarding I guess sort of our diplomatic policy as a nation in terms of the rest of the world. You know, here we read a lot and learn a lot about what's going on in terms of service in other countries and what's being done to correct or impact their particular social ills, whether that's poverty, whether it's human rights, whether it's children, whatever it may be. and we read about these things, and there's a lot of great innovative things going on in other countries. Yet here, as the U.S., we say, well, we've got all these great ideas, and we're going to tell you how you should implement them in your country. But yet there's all these wonderful things going on, and yet we don't seem to bring them back to our country. And I'm kind of curious if you could talk about that in terms of, maybe from your past experiences, working in the State Department, working in various administrations. What's the stopgap, or what's the barrier that seems to be preventing us from bringing back some of these great programs that are going on elsewhere in the world to actually affect issues that are very similar here in the United States?
Well, I don't think it's a State Department issue in the sense that the State Department doesn't, I don't think you'd want it to be the ones who are trying to figure out how we should do welfare reform in the United States. So the learning, the policy learning, ought not come from the foreign policy apparatus, which means we have to have other avenues and vehicles for doing this. This is a place where universities and think tanks have a big role to play, because that kind of comparative thing is quite important. And we do a lot of it. Historically, again, at the LBJ School, it's been mostly vis-a-vis Latin America, but there's a lot of, our urban and regional studies program spends a lot of time looking at urban regional policy throughout the Americas, and sort of what are we doing here, what's being done in Mexico, what's being done in Brazil. And so I think there is, I think the university setting is a good place for doing that comparative work, and I think it's a place where it's accepted. So then the question is how do you get into politics? I mean, it is true. I've worked in domestic policy at various points in my life, and one of the issues that I spent a lot of time on is healthcare. And the surest way to get something killed in Congress is to say, we're going to do the British plan, or the Swedish plan, or the Canadian plan. So I do think that there's a kind of a resistance in the political policy arena to a made somewhere else type solution. In part because, there's just a kind of suspicion that these are all socialist, welfare states, and they're not like us. And second, that kind of we're different anyway. It doesn't matter whether it could succeed someplace else. But I think the key is for the people who do the policy work to just, to be sophisticated about both doing the analysis, understanding the differences between what works in a smaller country or a more homogeneous country, for example, as opposed to the United States, and try to understand where are the opportunities to apply and do things. One place where I think it tends to work better to get that cross-fertilization is actually the state and local government rather than the federal level. I think that state and local officials tend to be a little bit more open to it, mostly because they have so many big problems that they're always looking for some way out of them. And it can be less politicized in potential on the sort of, is it made in America type. I think you can find that kind of experimentation in at least some communities. And if you can get it then transplanted here someplace and it works, then you have a better chance of it then catching on in other places. Transportation, for example. I mean, there are a lot of cities that have learned a lot from transportation strategies that have worked in other countries and have applied them here. Is one example.
I'm behind you.
Oh,
Dr. Steinberg.
You gave a very nice assessment of the condition of politics and economics in Russia. I wonder if you can step outside of your normal role here in the United States and look at the United States in the same way. From outside, how are we looking in terms of the various indicators you would apply to any other country?
Well, I mean, it depends which side of bed I wake up on every morning as to how I feel about it. I mean, on the one hand, there are a lot of things to be worried about. On the other hand, sometimes I think David Brooks is not entirely all wrong in reminding us that there are a lot of good things going on here too. There are, in part, on my more pessimistic side is that I think because of our great good fortune, we should be held to a higher standard than in a lot of other places. And so, to say that a lot of things are good here doesn't excuse the things that aren't, because we have more of an opportunity to meet that higher standard. And so, when you think about a lot of the big challenges in this country, ranging from growing inequality, income inequality, to the inability to deal with climate change, you sort of wonder, is our system working at all? And in my kind of looking from the outside, not as a non-American, but trying to think about what we need to do, I mean, I worry about the vitality of our political system a lot. You know, that it is, you know, it strikes me as becoming more and more dysfunctional, less and less able to generate good policy solutions, more and more polarized, gridlocked, just incapable of dealing with complex, interconnected challenges that we need to do to survive and thrive as a nation. And I worry about those structural things more than I worry about any specific policy thing, because if the processes can't work, then you have very little chance of implementing solutions that will deal with them. Whereas if the processes work better, then you at least have, you may not get it right the first or second, third time, but you at least have some shot of getting it. And so I worry about that. That's number one. And number two, I worry about the kind of our long-term, fashionable word is competitiveness now, but this sort of, are we investing in our children and education and the infrastructure that we need to remain able to meet the challenges of the world? And the National Academy of Sciences study worries me a lot. That's something that we all have to take very seriously. Again, Brooks is on the other side of this. He says, we're far more competitive. That one does worry me. I think that the overall level of performance of our kids is declining. We're not making investment. I kind of still believe in public schools, and I worry about the fact that our public school infrastructure is just collapsing in most places. So that worries me. I worry a little bit about American parochialism. I think about it from the other side, this whole question about are we sensitive enough to what's going on in other parts of the world. But I actually think deep down that's a problem. It's also a political process problem rather than an American people problem. As to say, again, polls are of limited value, but if you look historically at the polls about how people feel about what we should be doing to help others and keep international institutions going, the numbers are pretty good when you survey the American people. It's just somehow our institutions are not translating that into good policy. So again, it goes back to more of my concerns about the structural health of our democracy.
Sorry to get back into the Russian discussion, but since I mentioned to you that's kind of what I'm going to be looking at for my capstone, and I'm wondering if I may be jumping to conclusions thinking that there will be possible instability because of this continued dependency, and also, well, an extension from that, because now the proposal that Russia has made with Iran to kind of handle some of the manufacturing of the atomic energy there, and then maybe export components of it back to Iran for them to further develop without, giving them the full development of the whole program. I think that proposes maybe a big dilemma for the international community, because they don't have, I think, a proper mechanism in place for dealing with that. What do you think about that, and how do you think that may be addressed?
There are definitely problems with security of fissile material in Russia, but I think most people feel pretty confident that if the Iranians would take this deal, we'd all, breathe a sigh of relief and worry very relatively little about whether the Russians could manage that side of it, and be very grateful that a solution was found that didn't keep the fissile material in Iran. So I'm pretty comfortable with that. And when the Russians want to do it, they can do it. And there's actually been this whole, what's called the non-mover program, which is this effort to secure the nuclear materials in Russia. It's kind of ramped up in the 90s for reasons which are incomprehensible but indefensible, fell off in the beginning of the Bush administration, but they've woken up again, and it's now actually starting to ramp up again. And I can live with that, I guess is the answer. I don't think that's a deep worry.
But if other nations around the world would like to carry out a similar approach?
But what it is it is part of the answer to this problem, which is that, without getting a long and detailed discussion, and I spent a lot of time on this, in the long term, we have to internationalize control over the nuclear energy fuel cycle. And so if other nations would play this, and you could get the IAEA in there to inspect, have the Russians do it, under IAEA inspections and safeguards, absolutely. And if the Russians want to do it for everybody, that'd be okay for me too. I think people will want actually some diversity of supply, so it's not completely controlled by the Russians, so they couldn't pull the plug on the inspectors. But it is a movement in the right direction, which is to have a more international approach where everybody doesn't feel like they need to own the full fuel cycle. And, you know, it's really worrisome. I mean, right now, I mean, we worry about Iran and all that stuff, but, you know, if you think about the potential evolution of the nuclear capabilities in Northeast Asia, if the North Koreans keep going in the direction they're going, and let's say they get a little more belligerent, they test their nuclear weapons, the Japanese are somewhere between 2 and 4 months away from the ability to build a bomb. They have a full fuel cycle, and they've got plenty of good engineers who can figure out how to fabricate that stuff into bomb material. Okay? They're our friends, we like them, but there's something wrong with the system. That basically, where everybody who owns the fuel cycle is, you know, weeks or months away from having a bomb. Far better to have a system in which there is a sense in which nobody can own it, and everybody has a kind of collective responsibility. It's not quite the Baruch plan of the 1940s, but it's a way of giving a little bit more protection and oversight to the process. So it's a direction that I would be comfortable to go, and I'm prepared to let the Russians play that kind of role in it.
Okay, thank you.
One more question, and this is the final one.
I'll keep it short, relatively speaking. I'm wondering, I mean, with everything we've talked about, and then the people here and the people out there have this great interest in international issues and probably a better understanding than most, but we're moving toward this level of interdependency and globalism, whether you're talking about, you know, economics and jobs and trade and, you know, arms, just everything. And yet, probably more than any other, you know, industrialized nation, people in this country have little to no knowledge about what's happening in other countries and what's happening in our own country with regard to international policy and foreign relations. We're moving light years ahead so quickly. How do we catch up kind of the masses with that so that
I think this is
they
a
move
really,
with
it's a
us?
really interesting question. It's an important question for all of us because part of what's happened with this new world that's more horizontal, more networked, is the way that information flows and gets communicated is very different than what we all grew up with. And nobody's quite figured out how to make that work to achieve the goal that you want. I mean, in the old days, we all turned into the nightly news, and Walter Cronkite told us what we needed to know about it. And the saturation was high, and you know, you could question about who were these people, and who was making the judgments, and what did they care about. But nonetheless, there was kind of commonplace. Nobody watches, I mean, other than American Idol, as far as I can tell, nobody watches the same thing anymore. And so the question is, how do we make this world in which there's much more information potentially available, and yet no big pipe through which it's all going? You know, the old days, the model was one to many, broadcasting, one broadcaster to many people. Now it's 1 to 1, or 1 to a few, or a few to 1. And we need to think about that. And we're spending actually a lot of time in our school thinking. This is a very big passion of mine. And so one of the things that we've done is we've helped create this new consortium called the University Channel. And it started, the idea came from my good friend Anne-Marie Slaughter at the Liberal School. And it now consists of about 6 or 7 universities, but largely public policy school based, in which we're now trying to figure out new ways in which we capture content on what we do, not just international, but our public policy stuff, and get it out to people. Podcasting, broadcasting, direct feeds to local television stations, C-SPAN 12s, you know, but so part of it is we're trying to generate a lot more content that can be made available to people, and then we're trying to figure out how are people grabbing it, how do we get into people's RSS, how do we get into all this stuff, and be, you know, prolific about generating the content so it's there, and then imaginative about how to spread it. And we're all learning. I mean, and it changes every day. I mean, what worked yesterday isn't going to work tomorrow. And so you have to be incredibly dynamic and always adapting about this. We're implementing a reorganization on the administrative side of our school, in which I now collapsed the public affairs and the IT into one thing, because I think they are one thing. And so I want the people who are, I don't want somebody who's just writing press releases and doing print publications, because it doesn't even matter anymore. And I want the people who are doing this to think of these things seamlessly. We're building a a fiber-based video studio in the school, because I want to be able to get this stuff out there and be able to have people just go in there and, let's put out some content today, have some people talk about what was in the news, and have it use the university channel to get it out there so people can pull it down and they can, because if you can Google video and you can Google podcast and you can Google, you're going to get out there. And I don't know what the net result is, and I don't think we'd have the same kind of confidence that we had in the old world of mass markets and mass media. But somehow we need to get into the ether with this stuff, and if you get into the ether with it, I think we have a better shot at reaching people and catching up with others.
Sounds like blog heaven.
It is but part of it is, see, the thing that it's the difference between, it's not different because some of our people blog, I blog, but what's important at schools like ours and universities is you hope that quality will rise in this process. And so the problem with blogs is, there's a little bit unclear about how quality gets sorted out of this. But we think we have a mark, and so if you can communicate the way the bloggers do, but you have the mark of a good university or a good public policy school.
NPR blogging.
Right, exactly. Well, but absolutely. But I want. That's how I want to be seen, basically, is to be in that space. And so if people, are thinking about educational policy reform, and they've got lots of ways of, getting at this stuff. And again, part of it is you've got to get, in addition to the one-to-one or one-to-few, you have to get out to you reach out and touch them rather than waiting for them to come grab it from you. That's why I'm a big fan of RSS and things like that. We've got to find a way to get out there and have our stuff show up in your face rather than waiting for you to come to a website or to turn on a TV station to make it happen. Because otherwise we're not going to get the people that we want.
Jim, thank you so much.
Be happy.
Hey, how you doing? Good to see you. Oh, that's important. Yes. Wow, so soon. Wow. Ready? Stuff I gotta buy. Yeah. Are you ready? Shut it off.
I see you again. It's been a long time.
Where
you go? To the Netherlands.
So what do you do?